Okay, continuing with the 1960s, we're going to be taking a look at the free speech movement and some of the legacy movements from the 1960s. And the free speech movement gets its start in Berkeley, California, at the University of California. There is a gentleman there named Mario Savio, who is very much a student of the New Left, um, who basically charges the students. There's a picture in the bottom right of him standing out in front of the students talking to them. He's young, he's very dynamic, and he's talking about the fact that the university is trying to create little robots, basically trying to get rid of their individuality and make them into like little soldiers to go off to Vietnam. And really, at the heart of a lot of the free speech movement is this distrust of government, distrust of the establishment. Remember, we talked about that in the previous module. Um, and the role of the Vietnam War is very, very important because it's an extremely unpopular war, not just in the United States. And in France, you have communists that launch a general strike in May of 1968. West Germany, you have what they call Commune 1 or K1. Britain, UK, underground. And these are mostly countercultural movements of young people who are in opposition to the Vietnam War, who are committed to fighting the establishment. In Mexico, even in Mexico in 1968, you have student demonstrations and riots that take place against the universities. And there's this ultimate distrust of leadership. Some of the things that, of course, are combined in this is communes. Communes are groups of people who are living together. They're kind of a new form of community. In some cases, it's free love, like you're in a group of men and women who swap sexual partners, you do drugs together, you do sex together. Everything is ours. There's nothing of individual ownership. And you're living together because of your common belief in the counterculture movement, if that makes sense. So there's this whole new kind of idea about what individuality, political beliefs, all of these things, and they're trying to challenge the existing kind of status quo, if that makes sense. I hope it does. In Columbia in 1968, you have students to take over one of the buildings, and this is in protest of the Vietnam War. In Madison, Wisconsin in 1970, you have students protesting government research and connections with the military. Some of what the universities are researching are things related to Vietnam. And so the students are against the war, and so they don't understand why the university is working hand in hand with the military unless it was to further the war effort. Part of the countercultural movement is this idea of make love, not war, that it's peace, it's free love, that why are we trying to kill each other when we should just all be getting along. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You can't separate, unfortunately, sex, drugs, and rock and roll from the counterculture movement. Music is part of the mind's ability to escape this repressive society. Drugs help open your mind. Timothy Leary, who is a big proponent of LSD, his quote is turn on, tune in, drop out, meaning know what's going on, understand what's going on, but listen to yourself. Focus on making yourself um, a better person, a more enlightened individual. And of course, drugs will help you do that. Drugs expand your mind. They open your mind's ability to understand what's going on in the universe and what your place in the universe is. And then by dropping out, you're dropping out of society. You're rejecting society and the wrongs that the establishment have perpetrated against society. So personal liberation, a spirit of creative experimentalism, a search for a way of life in which freedom and pleasure eclipsed the single-minded pursuit of wealth. So it's the rejection of the 1950s household. This isn't, we aren't, you know, I don't want to live in a suburb and have a car and a family and, you know, my parents' life is not mine. I want my own. You know, the release from bureaucratized education and work, repressive rules of personal behavior, and more than anything, a military state in the name of freedom that rains destruction on a faraway people. This, you know, is all encompassing. It tells you everything, really, in a nutshell, of what the counterculture movement is all about. The counterculture movement emphasizes community, and this is expressed through the commune. And you have over 2,000 communes that are established nationwide. People living together, people growing their own food, you know, playing music, doing things together, and of course, drugs are part of that. Sex is part of that. And it's the idea that you're not going to be restrained. Certainly not by, you know, the standards of society. Organized religion even gets some of the counterculture movement, or it's forced to respond. I'll say that the Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 65 allows that masses will now be said in local languages and not just in Latin. Priests and church officials become active in social movements. This is a big deal because the Catholic Church did not allow priests and other officials to get involved in social movements. And you start seeing priests and nuns and sisters participating in civil rights demonstrations. Liberation theology, priests begin to mobilize peasants to action and demand social justice and economic equality. This is huge in Latin America. Pope Francis is known as part of the liberation theologists who supported mobilizing peasants to action in Latin America. You know, protesting, you know, working conditions or the government. You know, protesting water restrictions, this sort of thing. There are a group of people known as Jesus people who look at Jesus as the ultimate hippie. He had long hair, he dressed unusually, and he had a quest for universal love. And that is the ultimate expression of what the church is founded upon. So he becomes kind of a model in that aspect for other people to follow. The People's Temple. This was under Jim Jones. He was a very charismatic leader, almost becomes like a god to the people, the people who belong to the People's Temple. He blends Christianity with socialism and racial equality. And he sought to end the reliance of people upon religion. He called, like Marx, religion is the opiate of the people. It's a drug to get you to do what society wants you to do. Unfortunately, all of his followers, including him, die. They go to Africa. I'm trying to remember exactly how it happens. They go to Africa, and at one point, a U.S. senator and a team from the United States come to investigate the People's Temple. And while they're there, some of the members of the temple shoot them, and it's under orders from Jim Jones. And so they realize that, you know, the government is going to come for them, and so they all drink Kool-Aid mixed with, I think, arsenic or some poison, and so they end up dying. And that's the picture on the bottom left is the scene after they've all committed suicide. Woodstock is like the ultimate celebration of counterculture. You had thousands and thousands and thousands of people come out to this farm in New York. It was a 3-day celebration, and you can see just the number of people that were there. It's just staggering. And cars were lining the road going to Woodstock, and literally they're just stopped because there's nowhere for these cars to go. And so people would just get out, they'd leave their car, they'd get out and walk down the highway to go to Woodstock. So these are, you know, some of the bands over there listed on the ticket. Of course, Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, The Who, Canned Heat, the band, Joe Cocker, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Jimi Hendrix, Iron Butterfly, Arlo Guthrie, Joan Baez, you name it, they were there. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement isn't necessarily a legacy movement. It was in existence before 1960s. But as you'll see, the Civil Rights Movement begins to take a more radical turn. And I'm going to highlight some of the events leading up to that. Ruby Bridges is a small child in 1960 who was the first to integrate an elementary school in New Orleans. She gets a great deal of attention because she's a young black girl, has probably no idea what's going on, and they have to have federal marshals basically walk her to school to prevent her from being beaten up or worse. And so Norman Rockwell uses her image in this picture on the right called A Problem We All Live With. And here she is in her white dress, looking very angelic, and then all of these symbols of hate surrounding her. The N-word is up on the wall behind her. There's a tomato that's been thrown at her, and these men walking around her as well. Kind of a symbol of bravery. The March on Washington takes place in 1963. Asa Philip Randolph comes back and organizes the March on Washington that originally was going to take place in World War II, but decides to work with other organizations and go ahead and address the same issues, which were African American wages, working conditions, and you have a massive, massive amount of people that show up. Randolph and Bayard Rustin are really the two that organize the march itself, but then you have a number of leaders who make speeches, including Dr. King, who makes his famous I Have a Dream speech here. They brought about 200 to 300,000 people to Washington. 75 to 80% of the marchers were black. And you see some of the signs on the right. Randolph was involved with the unions, and so you have a great deal of union support for this as well. And that's one of the things. There's a woman standing there with a UAW hat on in that picture. The Highlander School is formed, and this is in the Appalachian Mountains. This is up in the mountains of like North Carolina. And all they do is they teach nonviolent demonstration methods. So when students do go for a sit-in demonstration at a restaurant, 9 times out of 10 they have been trained by someone who either trained them at the Highlander School, or that person trained at the Highlander School themselves and then came to train them on a local level. But this school is remarkable for its ability to help the students cope with some of the things that will happen. Typically, they would sit in a chair, have their hands out on the table, and they could not move their hands no matter what was said or done to them. And so the instructors would yell at them, they would throw things at them, try to mimic as much of what they would see in a real demonstration. Rosa Parks and Dr. King were both trained there, and a lot of their supporters as well. In 1961, we have the Freedom Rides. The original plan for this was in 1947. It was called the Journey of Reconciliation, but it doesn't actually happen until 1961. And so it began on May 4th, 1961 in Washington, D.C. with a rally, and then ended in New Orleans for a rally. And along the way, the Freedom Riders are arrested, jailed, beat up. There's even a bomb outside of Anniston, Alabama that blows up on one of the buses. It's typical for, they knew they would run into violence, but they were very much surprised about this. But basically what they're pushing for is the desegregation of public transportation. It had already been implemented, or it had already been approved by the Supreme Court. They'd already called for it, but it had not been enforced within the South. And so that was the purpose of the Freedom Rides, was to allow for whites and blacks to sit together on the bus and not have to be segregated. There were mass arrests in Jackson, Mississippi, and many of the Freedom Riders were sent to Parchman Prison, or Parchman Farm, which was a work prison. Notorious, Cool Hand Luke, which featured Paul Newman in a old movie. That's where that was filmed, and it was known for its horrible conditions. But Kennedy calls for a cooling off period, and he states that the riders are unpatriotic for what they're doing. So this kind of gives you a hint about what I was saying with Kennedy and his civil rights support. It's not very much there. 1963, we have the Birmingham, Alabama campaign. Birmingham had been nicknamed Bombingham because of the number of black houses that had been bombed. Many black families were beginning to move into white neighborhoods. And so what would happen is the KKK would come along and blow the house up. And then, of course, you didn't have to worry about it. The state of Alabama had banned the NAACP in 1956, and so Fred Shuttlesworth forms his own organization called the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, and he calls Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and asks them to come in to help desegregate the public accommodations there within Birmingham. Their big opponent, of course, is the Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor, and he used to ride around in this thing that looked like a tank. It's very touch and go. There's a great deal of violence that takes place. The police were using dogs. They were using high-powered hoses to break up the demonstrations. And at one point, they used children. They marched the children from the 16th Street Church downtown and then back. And all of the children were pulled out of school one day by their parents. And King gets a great deal of ridicule for this because he realizes that he's putting the children in harm's way. But all of this is done in front of the television. King always made sure that the demonstrations were timed so that when they ended, the news crews could get their film and the story to the national networks. So the national news, which would be able to show what was happening. And his idea, of course, was show America what was happening, and it certainly does a great job of doing. He does a great job of that, and he utilizes the media very, very skillfully. In September of 1963, the Birmingham church that they had used as the site for um, meetings before heading downtown for the demonstrations was bombed. And this was a Sunday morning. And the bomb kills four little girls. Um, and their pictures are down there at the bottom. And then the picture of what the bomb damage did is in the bottom right. But Birmingham is seen as a great success um, for King. Birmingham, the business leaders do end up, excuse me, they do end up making concessions to the black community, and so it's seen as a win for King. This is a picture of the children marching downtown. So this is part of the Children's Crusade. Selma in 1965, there's a demonstration. They're walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they're basically going to have a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery to protest the restrictions on voting rights. And so this was largely done through SNCC, but then Dr. King comes in. And so on March 7, 1965, they attempt the march, and they are met, and this is the picture in the upper right, they're met by the state police who basically beat the demonstrators into turning back. 2 days later, King comes in and says he's going to lead the march, and so they get over the bridge, and then he ends up turning them around because, again, they see the state police standing there. And this was a public relations kind of faux pas for King, because many of the supporters were ready to go forward on the 9th. But King is the one that turns them around. He does lead the challenge in the courts that they should be able to complete this march, and the governor is saying, well, you can't have any marches. Marches are outlawed. And so eventually he does hear that the case has been decided for him, so that they're able to complete the march. During the process of all this, there is a man there named James Reeb. He's a white man who is participating in the demonstrations who is killed. And Stokely Carmichael makes the comment that with all of this news about this white man who dies, he says, what about all the black men that have been killed in the fight for civil rights? Is this the measure of what a black man's life is comparison to the life of a white man? Which is, obviously a good point. Anyway, the march does finally take place on March 21st, 1965, and they do march all the way to Montgomery. Loving versus Virginia. This is a case between Mildred Loving and Richard Loving versus the state of Virginia. Virginia had passed a law in 1924 banning interracial marriages, and so their case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court overturns the convictions. Actually, the Lovings had both been jailed because of their relationship, and so they are at that point, their convictions are overturned. So where things begin to get a little bit more radical is towards the end of 1968. In the 1960s, you have this kind of infusion of the Vietnam War protests with the civil rights movement. Men like Malcolm X, who are preaching hate to the white man, that Malcolm X gets his name, basically the X is because he doesn't know what his name is, because the white man took him from Africa, brought him to North America, or his family his ancestors, and stripped him of his name. Um, and so his argument is that there should never be a trust between the white man and the black man. And so you start having this kind of rise of black power, awareness of black is beautiful. Um, the afro, the natural hair comes into style. And African Americans begin to embrace their African roots. Kwanzaa comes about during this period. This is a celebration um, that's supposed to connect African Americans to the homeland, to Africa, through a kind of ceremonial but more kind of a holiday-ish type recognition. African American history begins to be taught in universities across the country. And you have people like Adam Clayton Powell, that we've talked about before, who turns this black power, that the blacks actually do have power and that they can manifest that in many different ways. And so there is this re-energizing of the civil rights movement. People like Dr. King are ridiculed because they're not doing enough and they're not doing it fast enough. I just realized I had Malcolm X in two different places. But Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam calls for the recognition of African roots in terms of Islam, that Islam is part of the African heritage. And what's interesting about all of this is 68 brings about Dr. King. Dr. King has always been kind of looked at as kind of a conservative person. But by 1968, he begins what he calls his Poor People's Campaign, which was re-energizing his movement to call for equality in terms of wages and income, and address the inequality that exists between white and blacks. And so his message becomes a little bit more radical as well. But we tend to forget that. Most of our history is about the I have a dream speech and not about what he was fighting for in terms of income inequality. Images of the afro, the natural hair, and the popularity of it. You have the rise of the Black Panther Party in California. It forms as a revolutionary black nationalist organization in October of 1966. And really what they're doing is they're policing or patrolling the black neighborhoods in Oakland to prevent police coming in and brutalizing the citizens. And so if there were cases where, because what would happen previous to this was police would come in to the black neighborhoods in Oakland, and they would spot somebody walking down the street, and they would ask them, what are you doing? What are you doing here? And it would get escalated out of control. And so they would the Black Panthers would arm themselves and go around the neighborhood, and if they saw something going wrong, like a black man trying to rob a store or something, they would handle it. And so they wanted the police to basically use them in order to police their own neighborhoods. The idea was that who better to police the neighborhoods than the black neighborhoods than black men. But they also had a social element or social justice element to it as well. They had programs for free breakfast for children and community health clinics. And so, our image of them is that they're violence, they're a violent group, but really and truly they had a much deeper social justice and social cause element to them. J. Edgar Hoover calls them the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States at one point. I'm not sure I would agree with that, but, I wasn't alive then. So, okay, there's my... Two of the members of the Black Panther Party are Angela Davis and Kathleen Cleaver. And so they become kind of the face of a new activism that takes place within African American women. Angela Davis was born in Birmingham and lived on what they call Dynamite Hill as a child. She knew the victims of the church bombing. And so she gets involved with a number of socialist and communist groups living in New York. And she goes and she attended Brandeis University in Massachusetts and then travels to Germany and Paris. And she's able to kind of see this kind of world view. And she supported a group of inmates who was accused of killing a prison guard in Soledad Prison. And she provided the guns to the inmates that killed the guard. And so she becomes a fugitive herself and gets jailed. And while she's in jail, she gives an interview to the Swedish news crew that is interested in the Black Power movement. And so you can go on YouTube and watch the Black Power mixtape. And it's a very, very interesting interview. And I'll post a link to it. So that if you want to watch it, you can. But Angela Davis is probably one of the most famous of the Black Power female activists. Kathleen Cleaver married one of the members, Eldridge Cleaver, when they were working together in Fisk University. She comes to San Francisco in 1967, becomes part of the Black Panther movement, Black Panther Party. And she becomes the first female member of the Panthers' decision-making body. So very, very active Black women who are getting involved in So we're kind of going to zoom through this because we've talked a little bit about this. But again, the women's liberation movement is one that starts before the free speech movement. But as we get into the 60s, the women's liberation movement begins to take a different turn. So the first wave we've already talked about. We've talked about women, and it ends with them gaining the right to vote through the 19th Amendment in 1920. So take a look at these slides and the handouts as just kind of a refresher. What we're dealing with in the 1960s is the second wave of women's liberation. The origins are around the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. So many women, especially Black women, who were involved in the civil rights movement, like Ella Baker, calls for women to step up, not just to serve coffee to the leaders of the civil rights movement, but also to become leaders of the civil rights movement in their own mind and in their own way. So their goals are around social equality, reproductive rights, workplace, female sexuality, family, not female, sexuality, sexual violence concerns, and equal rights amendment. Major organizations now, National Organization for Women, the National Welfare Rights Organization. Your major players are Betty Friedan. She writes The Feminine Mystique, talks about how women in the 1950s felt vulnerable and felt like there was something missing in this kind of cookie cutter life where they were expected to stay at home and cook casseroles and clean the house and have children, but they weren't able to go out and work. And she says that is contrary to who and what women are, that excuse me, women should be able to go out and make a living if that's what they want to do. Some of the tactics that they're using: protests and picketing, demonstrations and marches, advertising and public relations, books and publications. And some of the highlights, I won't go through all of this, but the big thing that comes out of the second wave is the Equal Rights Amendment. In 1967, it's introduced in Congress. It ultimately fails, and we'll talk about why when we start talking about Ronald Reagan. But in 1972, the ERA amendment actually gets sent to the states for approval. So it makes it through Congress, but the states have to approve it. 1973, you have Roe v. Wade that's decided by the Supreme Court, which actually is not a Warren Court decision. It's actually a Burger Court. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Actually, not a minute. We'll talk about it in another module. Sorry. The third wave is a little bit more modern. This is around the 90s and really up until like 2000. This is expanding the movement to include non-white women and gay and lesbian women. One of the major events is the Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas hearings. Clarence Thomas, when he was nominated for the Supreme Court, was accused of inappropriate actions towards Anita Hill. Other major figures: Hillary Rodham Clinton, Janet Reno, Madeleine Albright, Kaylee Bay Hutchinson. And the tactics change here. Women don't just protest, they become part of the political spectrum. They're running for office. And you have a little bit more of a in-your-face kind of attitude, that women are embracing their sexuality, but recognize that if they do that, that doesn't mean that they should be able to be taken advantage of or raped or what have you. So a little bit different of a twist than what we see in the second wave feminism. Fourth wave is what we're dealing with today, and it's mostly through social media and through technology. You have women's marches that are taking place on an annual basis. But again, social media is embracing this and allowing the message to get out, and this is how many women are getting the message out there. Big thing to think about, that this is non-traditional women. These are people that normally, we're talking about non-white, African American, Muslim Americans, you name it. Women are now beginning to what they call awake or become woke to the message of equality. Another legacy movement is the LGBTQ movement. The gay rights movement began in the the late 1800s. There is a Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld who in Berlin produces or writes a paper or presents a paper talking about gay rights in 1897, if you can believe it. So it goes back a long way. This isn't a new movement. In 1924, you have the Society for Human Rights that's founded in Chicago. In the 1950s, you have the rise of the Mattachine Society in LA and the Daughters of Bilitis in San Francisco. And really what the LGBTQ movement at this point is doing is it's trying to build awareness that these people even exist, that there are gays and there are lesbians and there are people who don't fit the traditional mold of, in terms of sexual orientation. None of these organizations are calling for, major demonstrations or anything radical. What they're really doing is they're just trying to identify themselves and say, hey, we are here. It's not really until the late 1960s that you begin to have a more militant gay rights movement. The Stonewall riots that take place in June of 1969 at the Stonewall Inn in New York, it's really the culmination of when lesbians and gays and transsexuals begin to declare themselves present. And so you have the creation of the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance. And by the following year, in 1970, they throw a parade. It's the first gay pride parade called the Christopher Street Liberation Day. But it's basically to pay homage to the Stonewall riots. What happens in Stonewall is you have police that will occasionally raid gay bars and arrest people. And in this case, they had been picking on several of the gay bars in the area, including the Stonewall Inn, the police, that is. And so many of the people who were at the bar literally turn around and say, you know what, this is just too much aggravation and persecution, and we're just not going to take it anymore. And so that's really, really what it comes from. In 1977, you have Anita Bryant, who launches her Save the Children Coalition. And basically what she's trying to do is stop gay couples from being able to adopt children. And so she comes to Florida and she has this speaking engagement, and the picture at the bottom right is her after somebody threw a pie in her face during her press conference. But what you're seeing is the rise of the moral majority and Jerry Falwell and his Clean Up America campaign. It's part of what conservatives are seeing as the slip of a moral America, that homosexuality is beginning to gain ground. We don't have prayer in schools. Religion is being, Christians are being persecuted because they can't pray in school. It's a culmination of a lot of things. And so you have this kind of, the conservatives are certainly setting themselves up for opposition to any sort of gay rights movement. But at the same time, you do have several advances for gays and lesbians. In 1962, Illinois decriminalizes homosexuality, and it's the first state to do that. In 1977, Harvey Milk is elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, and they pass a gay rights ordinance. They also defeat Proposition 6, which forbid homosexual teachers. In October 1970, you have the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights. And then in 1980, the Democratic Party endorses homosexual rights as part of its platform. July 1981, you have the identification of AIDS. And this is during Reagan's time, and we'll talk a little bit more about Reagan and the AIDS epidemic. You have the first World AIDS Day in December 1st, 1988, and every December 1st since then is World AIDS Day. You have the passage in 1996 of the Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriage as a legal union between man and woman. No state is required to recognize same-sex marriage from another state. At that time, there were several states that would perform same-sex marriages. And so even though many gay couples were going to these states that allowed it, this law basically nullified their wedding. Oh, and here it is right here. Vermont becomes the first state to legalize civil unions and registered partnerships between same-sex couples. Vermont was one of the states that allowed marriage in the 90s. 2003, Supreme Court rules that sodomy laws in the United States are unconstitutional. Sodomy was the crime that many gays were charged with as a way to stem homosexuality. Gay marriage is legalized in Massachusetts, followed by New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Iowa, and DC in 2004. And then in 2013, you have the Defense of Marriage Act struck down by the Supreme Court. So now gay marriage is the law of the land as we have it right now. Native American rights are also part of the legacy movements. 1953, Eisenhower is following a policy called termination policy. The American government withdrew official recognition of tribes as legal entities. And they're under the governance of states. State laws like non-Indian peoples. So you're trying to undermine the tribal control within the reservations. You have an American Indian movement in Chicago in 1968. And as a result of this kind of rise of Native American rights, Congress passes the Indian Civil Rights Act in 1968, recognizing the legitimacy of tribal laws within reservations. So it seems like we go back and forth in all of that. And as good as that is, Native Americans are still pushing for equal protection under the law, even today. But you have a clash in 1968 of Indian fishermen in Puget Sound. The Indians take over Alcatraz Island in 1969, claiming that the island was actually Indian territory, even though it's abandoned. And if you go there, you'll actually see the bottom left. That is Alcatraz, and you'll see this Indians welcome, United Indian Property, Indian land. They had taken control of the island. And so what you're seeing over time is this kind of push by Native Americans for recognition from the federal government and protections. That's the main thing. They're looking for legal recognition. Eventually, yes, full equality, but certainly protections through the law. Latino American rights, Latino populations in the U.S. explode during World War II due to labor shortages. We've talked about the Bracero program. By 2010, we have 50 million Latino Americans. Cesar Chavez, who was the leader of the United Farm Workers and the National Farm Workers Association, utilizes nonviolent tactics in order to make the cause to organize workers a moral cause. So he's trying to better wages, working conditions, and just trying to make a better life for the workers that are coming here in droves. And he organizes a lot of these workers in California as well as in Florida. And then last but not least, the environmental movement. Silent Spring is a book by Rachel Carson in which she talks about the detrimental effects that like pesticides like DDT put into our food, into our water system, that we're basically killing our environment, but we're also killing ourselves. And so her book becomes a bestseller, and people begin to realize that we need to start recognizing, a conservation movement, but also to try to help protect our environment. And so this is the first time when this really starts happening is in the late 70s. I'm sorry, in the early 70s. The first Earth Day is actually 1970. And so Carson is really considered to be kind of the launching point for an environmental movement. Again, it's an environmental movement like the Sierra Club. It's formed, many years before, but now it's beginning to be seen as a necessity and something that must be done. And what's interesting about this is that Richard Nixon is one who really begins to push for the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. We'll talk more about that when we talk about Nixon.